My interest is at the moment mostly in trying to determine how much of such an experience is self-generated and how much might be considered external in the generic sense, assuming that the distinction has any, ultimate validity. So I guess I'm curious, first of all, if you reflect on it, what your sense is now and maybe what your sense was at the time that it unfolded about, how much of it might have been internally generated, how much, if any, was external, and so on.
Well, when you ask that, it brings me back to one of the striking and memorable lines in The Key, when the interlocutor defines real inner vision as having a quality of unmistakable spontaneousness. And I would say that a lot of these drug-induced experiences have a quality like that. They emerge with a sort of freshness and otherness, which tempts one to suppose that they have an ontologically independent reality. Of course, that in and of itself doesn't answer the question. It's only the first of many suggestive details that could be explored.
So your sense at the time when the experience was unfolding, and I suppose still in retrospect, was that given the spontaneity of how it unfolded, it had the quality of a real and not imaginary experience.
Well, somewhat. But it can't be underestimated that the mind is an incredibly complex phenomena, and the brain is a outstandingly complex instrument. There are more neural connections in the brain, if I remember correctly, than there are stars in the galaxy. And if you consider uh, the emergent behavior that could occur from something like that, when you disrupt its normal functioning, the kind of epiphenomenal sort of output that it could generate. The possibilities are quite enormous.
Well, I'm trying to pin it down further. The discussing the mind as an epiphenomenon versus the brain would have some bearing on it, I suppose. And if you want to be some sort of hardcore materialist and say that it can only be in the brain, that the mind is only a function of the brain, and so on the basis of that alone, the physical complexity, you could, of course, say that these experiences might seem totally alien and bizarre and independent. And yet, that's just because we're mostly unaware of the physical complexity that we ourselves possess. But that doesn't get us any closer to knowing the answer either.
Well, maybe it could be cleared up a little bit if I talk about some of the experiences themselves.
Sure. Now, to be clear, are we talking now about more than one or one in particular?
Oh, well, there was a series of experiences fairly close together, and then I revisited the substance a little while after that.
Oh, good. All right.
Well, a few weeks after that was the second one. The first instance, we were vaporizing it while we were still dosed on LSD. So it seemed to be if you're going to try DMT, why not just go all the way? As a matter of fact, the next time I want to mix it together with some salvia leaves and some LSD just to see what'll happen.
Jesus. Well, yeah, I would say that's going more than all the way. That's kind of like running laps around the building. Once you've arrived at your destination, then you're going above and beyond the Call of Duty by running around. But okay, good. So the first time then was on top of LSD.
And
Uh,
the second
okay.
series of experiments was taking it by suppository, because I had heard that the bioavailability was much higher and the duration of the experience would be longer. So I did some research about how to effectively do that. That was very interesting as well. But let's go back to the first time. I remember I had a great deal of trepidation uh, taking this substance, um, a sort of holy terror almost, because, at this point, I've heard untold stories about how, immediately upon inhaling this smoke, you're in an entirely alien world without reference to any of the spatial or temporal dimensions that you take for granted. And what I experienced, now if I can remember, the first thing that was striking me was language. There was a coherent and yet bewilderingly complex, sort of digitized holographic language that was transiting along this sort of uh, holographic heads up display, which was itself multidimensional. And the language seems very much like the characters and the carrot material. If you'll recall that series of online, potentially hoaxed uh, UFO photographs and purportedly disclosed secret documents, but also other languages in the same genre of literature um, that use, for instance, that have come out of people's sketches from their alien abductions. Now, that could mean one of two things. It could mean that some primordial part of the brain that's responsible for the generation of language is being activated. It could mean that if there's a subjective component to the recollection of abductions, that that part of the brain is also being triggered. Or, of course, it could mean that the mind is now interfacing with some level of reality where this kind of information is stored, or some level of reality where uh, these sorts of informational beings subsist.
Well, I take the point. There does seem to be, at least from what I've heard, the sort of common thread when it comes to the DMT experience. The thematic is never one of, I don't know, multicolored Care Bear, fluffy, round type uh, things and bodies and entities. It always has this kind of cold, hyper rational, calculating. And what you're saying is sort of like a, hyperdimensional linguistic aspect. Um, sure, you can imagine as many potential reasons why that that is that. I mean, the sky's the limit. But okay, so there's a display, and I guess say more.
Well, there's a series of displays. At first, there was something that sort of reminds one of the stock exchange. You've got a ribbon of text moving along a surface, but it's a much more complex surface than that. It's a sort of lattice of overlapping holographic displays. And then there was something like a sort of luminous touch screen, except they were pyramidal. And they're, sort of suspended in space, and on them you have the same sort of imagery. Um, Another thing that I remember from well, that was the first time I smoked it on that sitting. That was the sort of thing that was seen. And then upon doing it again, there was a sense of a sort of conscious darkness, a sort of infinite but affectively neutral but conscious darkness, which extended forever, and which in which physicality, as normally understood, was absent. But it wasn't just like a darkness. There were in that a sort of moving, living, geometrical sort of reality, but which were in a way composed of the darkness itself. And so there were intimations of fantastic complexity within this sort of strange, absolute black immersion. And in smoking it again in the same sitting, I remember uh, something like a some kind of old computer display, some kind of late 80s, early 90s display where you've got some kind of graphing program, and there are these yellow or green objects that are transiting the screen, and these sort of blinking cursor type things where you could input a character. And the impression that I had was that it's like a mapping of the underlying laws in the universe, as if the cosmological constant and the relative strength of matter and antimatter and the value of the four fundamental forces was somewhere and somehow being computed and adjusted as if they were an administering consciousness, which is technological in nature. Very strange and striking stuff.
Hmm. Well, it sounds that way. Now, did you, during this first sitting, encounter any of these much vaunted entities, or was it a kind of, or was it simply what you've described, moral machinery and displays and so on?
The first sitting, there was a sense of the presence of entities, but it was in the second sitting, probably the day after, that the entities made themselves apparent. My girlfriend, she smoked some of it, and she said that she could see an entity that was immediately in her face as if examining her being and as if peering into her mind. And she rather comically, was saying, well, is this ever going to end? Like, this is terrifying. This feels like it could go on forever, and reality will never return to what it was. And a friend of ours who had never done any psychedelics was sitting there with us, waiting to try it himself, and his trepidation was growing, and he was very unsure whether or not he would take it into himself. So that I took it, and apparently I was clutching my eyes and weeping. Um, and so his trepidation grew further because there was something that could be described as a jeweled and reflective mirror-like version of a sentinel from the Matrix, but much more amoeba-like and mercurial. And it was in my face and sort of examining my consciousness. Um, and then so the third person took it, but didn't get as much of an effect as sort of interesting geometries, but was able to face the situation despite the horrible things that were being said by the rest of us who were present. So there you have your entities.
Well, when you're clutching your eyes and weeping, that's always a good thing. That's
I I would say that's a good sign. Yeah.
yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay. So, I mean, from the sounds of it, there was a first sitting, and then maybe the next day there was a second sitting with more people involved. Have I got that right?
Yeah, and then a few weeks later there was the suppository, and that was different in character. It was more of a sense of a space in which there were sort of digitized realms and sort of scalar fields and vectors, and there was also a sense of, oh, well, I should say, in all of this intermittently, it's sort of hard to remember. There are interlacing frames of other experiences. In the first experience, there were sort of occult sigils as well. There were what appear to be hermetic or alchemical uh, symbols of fantastic complexity that were sort of interwoven, sort of in a alternating frame sort of way with the mathematical experiences that I'm talking about. So I think you could say that there's a highly symbolic character to this. Symbols and archetypes as being, some kind of summation or encoding of conscious experience are ever making themselves apparent in these experiences. And that was the case with this second thing. There were sort of uh, um, entities that were sort of, it's really hard to put into words. They were otherworldly, mm, biological, and yet mm, something composed of, as if it were they were part of some kind of artistic medium, as though they had been constructed by a mind for an aesthetic purpose, rather than having evolved through natural selection. And it's familiar in a way, because something I've been finding as I delve more and more into psychedelics is that in our culture there's all kinds of imagery that comes from the LSD and the DMT experience and from other psychedelics and from psilocybin, and then once you've gotten more familiar with them, you can recognize when you see a piece of science fiction or some graffiti, oh well, this has some inspiration in those realms. And this is the kind of, I have a appreciation for the fact now that this imagery and this sort of color palette has permeated the world of art and science fiction in a way that I don't know if people really fully appreciate. I think if you were to do a study on the emergence of some of these drugs, and if you were to look at the imagery that comes up around the culture in the decades following their rise to popularity, you'd find a close correlation. Point being that some of this has a kind of familiarity because of that.
I don't doubt it. Yeah, I think you're probably absolutely right in that regard. A lot of this, I've seen a certain amount of so-called psychedelic art in the last few months by checking out a few websites and so on. And anytime something takes a place out there in relation to every other kind of established art, you always have cross contamination and push pull back effects and implications being drawn and so on. So I don't doubt for a minute that a lot of unacknowledged debt is owed to the psychedelic experience when it comes to just the visual art medium, just from the last 50 or 60 years.
For sure. So, if we're going to get back into the question of the independent reality of these experiences, I mean, I think, based on, the sort of things that I'm talking about, it's really quite an open gambit. Um, but personally, I mean, I have a strong feeling that the mind is more than the brain because I've had lots of experiences where temporality is violated by some sort of conscious experience, or of being able to know and perceive things that are not available through ordinary sensory channels. And it all adds up to me, along with, of course, all the empirical evidence that's been compiled by parapsychologists and all the anecdotal evidence from throughout human history, that the mind is able to access times and places other than where the body is situated. And because of that, it's not unreasonable to suppose that in these experiences, consciousness is being tuned to something else.
Well, I wouldn't rule it out as a possibility. Naturally, everything you just said, I would mostly concur with as far as the parapsychological goes and so on. By the same token, I've been going back and forth on it because, at your recommendation, I've been listening to a lot of recordings of Terence McKenna and other descriptions of psychedelic experiences over the past few months. And the individual variation in the accounts, it seems to me, probably owes to the individual character of the participants to some large extent. I mean, it's hard to pin down exactly how, because you can't really pin down exactly what a person is. You can't say a person is just one thing, but there seem to be correlations. When you have Terence McKenna seeing leprechauns, maybe not by the same name, but comic figures of a certain type of character and disposition that may have a direct link to aspects of his own personality, and other people who are maybe less interesting as people or less provocative as thinkers, they have sort of experiences that are more two-dimensional or less, I don't know, less complex or complicated. Even if you can't say there's an absolute connection between this person and be able to predict from this person to a type of experience, it seems to be that there is a way to correlate the two in some way, if you know what I mean. So in the classic sense, I wouldn't say that it's all external. And in that regard, when it comes to DMT, a lot of what I read or encountered seems to me to be somewhat overhyped. I saw the documentary DMT, the Spirit Molecule, based on the book by a doctor, Rick Strassman, who apparently did research into it at some length and so on. We may have discussed it before. But when you watch the documentary, as opposed to the book, after a certain point, the documentary begins to just play as an infomercial. Probably around the 30-minute mark, you've seen everything you need to see, and all of the information that is going to be communicated in the documentary has been. But now it's just kind of like this repetitive proselytizing, which, okay, fine, but then why? So when I read about DMT and I hear the accounts and people go on about, wow, it's a totally different thing because unlike some of these other psychedelics, now you're breaking through into a transcendental state of reality and all of these entities seem totally externally generated, alien intelligence. And then you see the attempt to link these entities with the entities in the abduction scenarios. I find that they're probably pushing too hard.
Well, I would agree, especially since, I've had a sort of interesting sort of trekking backwards with psychedelics because by the time, I started doing psychedelics in general, I already had many years of experience with meditation, and so I was familiar with a lot of those states and was able to make some correlation between those states and Order Horizon psychedelics, whereas usually it goes the other way. Psychedelics act as a kind of gateway drug to contemplative discipline. People think, well, maybe I could meditate or, I could do ceremonial magic or something. And then people discover the states without the sort of neurochemical catalyst, right? But I had the opposite. And in like manner, I have the opposite sort of happy accident of having experience with the visitors. And I could say categorically that, as far as I've experienced it, these are two entirely different things, or at least two entirely different manifestations if there is an overlap. I mean, of course, there are certain broad similarities. There's terror, there's otherness, right? But the visitor phenomena as I know it is something much more fully penetrated into our world. It's something physical. It's something uh, that isn't so it is trickster like. I mean, I think as I'm trying to say it, it has a, it sounds similar. There it's other, it's terrifying, it has a sort of trickster like quality, but there's a qualitative difference which is very substantial, and I would now be more hesitant than ever to chalk the visitor phenomena off to something that's a sort of co-creative product of the human imagination interacting with an archetypal world. There is something that's real in a way that, more in a way that we usually use the word real uh, when it comes to the alien abduction experiences. I know it.
Well, it's very interesting what you say, and it washes with what I've been able to gather for whatever that's worth. It's a sign of the limitation of our everyday discourse that because our language is so rooted in everyday utility, things that, to list the criteria you just gave, that are terror inducing and full of otherness and so on, simply for being equal in that there's no place for them in the everyday, they end up being made equivalent by people trying to theorize what's going on. You take one terrifying confrontation with otherness and you make it the same as a different terror inducing confrontation with otherness simply because we're so rooted in the everyday that it's hard for us to distinguish unless you have experienced them directly, as you say you have. And there are probably people who have also experienced both, but still confuse the two. So even they aren't necessarily guaranteed to neatly distinguish between the two. That's how hard it is for us to deal with it.
Sure. You know, I mean, uh, I mean, when you're on a drug, I mean, it's quite apparent that you're on a drug. I mean, everything about your mind is working differently. I mean, there's still a sense of, I'm here, this is who I am, depending on what you're taking. There are things that you could do where you could lose the sense of self as you know it. I had that experience with Salvia Divinorum a few times, but I mean, a lot of times with this visitor thing, I mean, the world is the world as you know it, and there's some sense of alteration of consciousness. There's a sense of a channel being slightly tuned to a different station, between the radio stations as you know them. There's an otherness for sure. There's an alteration in consciousness when the visitors are around. There's no doubt about it, and that can be more extreme. But there's not a sense that the whole brain is just set to something else, and so what you're seeing is being is light filtered through that kaleidoscope. There's more sense of this is something that's here, as being, and this is something that's happening, and the alteration in consciousness is a co-emerging with that. It's a byproduct. It's not that this entity that is here and this thing that is happening is a product of the mind being set a different way. It's very, very different.
I don't think that point is emphasized enough or made clearly enough in all of these various conversations you hear about this. Um, if you actually think about it and you're, somewhat honest, consciousness alters significantly all the time. The example of, the quasi parapsychological example of, you come home and there's a burglar or a killer hiding in the closet, and you have this feeling, your consciousness is in a different state at the moment of that odd perception. But even more mundane than that, I mean, if you are invited to a dinner at a restaurant with, Orson Welles, for Christ's sake. If you have some big guy there who's full of presence, his presence fills the room, so to speak. This is not just a sum of the parts type thing where someone who's a trained actor or speaker, whether it's Orson Welles or not, you get the idea. I mean, there are people who simply, through their presence, alter the consciousness of those around them. I mean, dramatic examples include, coming to face with someone who probably is a real criminal, someone who's killed people. It's not simply the physical aspect, maybe the deadness to the eyes or whatever it is that you might want to chalk it off as, but your consciousness is affected all the time in this way that a lot of people discussing this say only happens in the presence of the so-called visitors, for example. It seems to me absolutely natural. It seems to me inevitable that if you are in the presence of other conscious beings, especially those who might have a more powerful consciousness than our own, but naturally your own consciousness will be affected. And certainly if there are beings you're not accustomed to experiencing, the change in your consciousness will be something very distinct when compared to things you've felt or experienced in the past. And I believe that extends probably even to the so-called Oz factor, where if you've got a flying saucer looming overhead, everything goes quiet, time seems to flow differently. I think that happens anyway, to a much smaller, perhaps, extent between human beings all the time. Time slows down, time speeds up, perception changes. So in that regard, if you can get rid of this, it's too much to call it a theory, but this supposition maybe that our consciousness is always pretty much the same, except when we're in the presence of otherworldly visitors or when we're on psychedelics, and therefore the two must be intrinsically the same somehow. If you can get rid of that idea, then you don't have to equate otherworldly contact with psychedelic experience.
Most definitely. Our consciousness changes all the time, as you say. If people are in a state of crisis, time slows down. If people, are told some life-altering news, time slows down. There are all sorts of situations, people wind up in. If they're romantically enamored and if they've met someone, the subjective quality of one's experience can alter in all kinds of well-acknowledged ways that haven't been brought into sort of conversational context with this sort of thing. And I mean, the fact that, it's what might be an alien and what might be otherworldly technology, that will, jolt the mind in and of itself. And then, of course, if we acknowledge also that these beings appear to have a very powerful consciousness, they appear to be telepathic, they appear to be atemporal in their perception, so that will impact you as well. And, the combination of this sort of what John Mack calls ontological shock, with the fact that, we may or may not be picking up on the field of conscious experience with the other beings around us unconsciously all the time, with the fact that these beings' fields and these beings are, altogether different from us in a number of crucial ways. Really, it at least introduces that there's a host of variables that aren't being taken into account when people just sort of blanket equivocation because of superficial narrative similarities.
Yeah, I fully agree. The sittings that you did, each hit, if you want to call it that, the duration of these experiences, how long would you say each one lasted?
Well, that's hard to say. We're talking about a couple minutes, but the subjective experience of time is really weird there. So, it's hard. A lot of times if I look at a clock on LSD, I have a hard time comprehending it. I'm looking at these hands and where they're pointed. I'm like, well, I know this means something. Okay, 'cause I'm trying to figure out where I am in the trip and how much longer it's going to be. So I'm looking at what they're pointing. I'm looking at the angle. I'm looking at the numbers. I'm trying to put it together, and it doesn't. It just won't come together. It takes like a supreme conscious effort to interpret it. So I mean, time's weird with all this stuff.
So then these three experiences, are they the sum total, or was there more than that?
Oh no, with DMT, I would say that that's the sum total. I mean, with other things, I mean, there's a good many more experiences that could be spoken about. I think that, people have become so overawed with DMT that, there's been very little discussion about the implications of the LSD experience. I mean, back when it was the era of Timothy Leary and Ram Dass. I mean, people were talking about this with great fascination, but it seems to have been sort of buffeted to the side. But it seemed to have a lot to say as well, you know. And so yeah, but those are the only experiences with DMT.
The two things that come to mind from all of these long McKenna talks that I've been listening to. For one, he repeats um, again and again that LSD for him had a kind of psychoanalytic quality, as if it induced some sort of uncomfortable psychoanalytic style introspection in him, um, which I suspect is probably just something individual to him, but maybe more people experience that. I'm not sure. Would you say you had anything like that, or no?
Well, I don't know. I mean, at this point, I mean, I'm not sure how many times I've done LSD. I really am not, and I've done it with in pretty decent doses, and I've done it a good number of times, and so the experiences range quite a lot. I mean, it often can be like deeply psychotherapeutic. I mean, I had the experience once of was feeling like I opened up a portion of my brain or a portion of my mind that had been completely forgotten, as if there were all these old untraveled neural connections that had to do with childhood, which hadn't been activated in a long time, and there were patterns of co-activation that constituted the conscious experience of the child. And so, in a way, it was a kind of engram, was a kind of map of that whole period of time with its associations and its worldview. So I mean, that's highly psychotherapeutic in nature, but there are other things that are sort of so have to do with spiritual openness. I was saying before that you can trace a lot of aesthetic, artistic things to the emergence of drugs into our culture. And I think once you've done LSD, you can really appreciate a lot of New Age rhetoric and where it comes from. Because, I mean, when I talk about, spiritual things, it's in a sort of moderated, qualified, sort of intellectually rigorous way. But I remember the first time I did LSD with my girlfriend, we were just, you know, talking about universal love and oneness, in a very sort of broad way, but it was sort of a window into sort of that angle of looking at everything, and that's how things make sense a lot of the time from LSD. So yeah, there's that sort of spiritually rhetorical altered standpoint. There's the psychotherapeutic thing that can happen, but then there's this kind of archetypal sort of imagistic thing that can happen where the world is transformed, and there is an independent, alien, otherworldly quality in what arises. It's not just arbitrary. There's a sort of there's something like synesthesia. Synesthesia, of course, being when music is transformed into imagery in your subjective experience, except it's like a synesthesia between ideas and and principles and meaning and the imagery that arises in the world. And the world is transformed, and interlacing with the world is a sort of science fiction slash fantasy uh, um, realm with different qualia of light where everything is alive and everything is meaningful. So yeah, the point of me going on about this is to say, you can't really just pin it down to, a psychotherapeutic experience. There's a lot of weird and interesting and worthwhile things that go on in that experience. It's very multifaceted.
Well, I don't doubt it. I think if you have as individual a kind of mind as Terence McKenna, that the way things break down for you between this substance and that substance will also be probably highly individualized. And there was a questioner who sort of called him out on that at one point. He had said something along the lines that on ayahuasca, you'd never hear voices. Rather, you get some sort of visual presentation. And of course, somebody else in the audience who had been, equally experienced or at least sufficiently experienced said, well, as a matter of fact, I know that blah, blah, blah. Yes. So it does seem that people have a variety of different reactions to different substances, and that you can generalize for yourself. I mean, if you have the same type of reaction to a substance, again and again, that's certainly permissible to generalize, but to universalize, it seems kind of tricky to do.
Yeah, because I think within one's own subjective experience, there are patterns that recur. There are certain types of patterns that I'll see across LSD trip to LSD trip, but I don't imagine anyone else has the same recurrence of those same patterns, And I think that with all this, if there is an independent reality, it comes down to, it's as if you're shining a light through a prism or a kaleidoscope. I mean, the light has its own independent reality. And this is true of mystical experience too. But when it hits the highly individuated and internally faceted dimensions of your mind, it's going to break that light up into its component colors in all kinds of unique ways. And, you can only guess backwards from studying the commonalities what the commonalities are. But are those commonalities to the structure of the mind, because every one of these crystals is similar, or are they commonalities to the nature of the light? So there are these sort of variables that are hard to tease apart if you're trying to get at the reality. We have a real reiteration of the phenomenal and nominal problem again, but sort of with the volume turned up.
It makes me think of something that you recounted at one point. You mentioned an experience that you had had. I guess you were sleeping and your girlfriend was there next to you, but awake, and you had dreamt that there was a creature at the foot of the bed, and she woke you up, and you realized that there was in fact a creature at the foot of the bed. And provided I've got that basically right, it always struck me that, I mean, in combination with other things, that what that story shows is that there is a kind of substratum to everything that you might call mind, but that at the same time, even in the psychedelic experience, which everyone takes for granted, is profoundly mental in some regard. I'm not saying internal, external in its genesis, but I'm saying that's certainly a mental experience, I suspect that not even in the psychedelic experience do you necessarily tap into that nature, that basic aspect of mind in the same way. For example, did you have the chance to listen to that clip that I sent by email, the Long Island story?
I don't remember. I'm not sure. Maybe you could reiterate it.
It's probably too much to go into detail, and maybe, depending on what's said here, I'll tack it on at the end of the discussion, but it's
Next up on the campfire is Tommy. He's been listening for 2 or 3 years. Originally got introduced via our old app, and now we have a new app, Jim Harold Central. So glad that he found us that way. And he has a story about a dream, and he's from Long Island, New York. We're so glad to have him on the line. Tommy, thank you for joining us, and tell us what happened.
Okay, this happened around 2003, I guess it was. I used to go out on Friday or Saturday nights to a particular bar that was near my house, and I could walk there, so I wouldn't have to worry about driving
Right.
and whatnot. And there was a pretty jumping place and whatnot. Well, anyway, there was a girl that used to come in there, and I found myself somewhat attracted to her, but in a kind of strange way, like I'd never been attracted to somebody before, and it was very magnetic. And another strange thing about her was her eyes seemed to be black, like almost like not have any, I guess the iris part of the eye.
Almost like the black-eyed kids that we hear about. Yeah.
Yeah. But her eyes were like magnetically like attractive, and I almost was like afraid of her. I mean, I couldn't like talk to her. She'd sit at the bar stool next to me, and I'd get the cold kind of feet thing going on, which is normally not what happens to me. There was some kind of presence about her that was it was so magnetic. It was like like staring into the sun, so to speak, for lack of a better analogy. I would look forward to seeing her come in there, and it seemed like she would come in around the bars in New York close at 4, like around 3 in the morning. So it would seem like she might have gone out clubbing and then just dropped into the neighborhood bar before going in or whatnot. But it was just strange that she'd always be coming in around 3 in the morning.
Right.
So one night she was like flirting with some guy in the most like seedy part of the bar where like the restrooms are and whatnot. And I decided to ask the bartender, who I had like a rapport with, about her. I said, this girl, I see her all the time. I didn't let him know that I was to her or whatnot. Do you know anything about her? And he's like, oh, what girl? And I like described her, and he goes, oh, she's a floozy or whatnot. So in my mind, right then and there, I kind of just like wrote her off as like, well, you know what? Don't even like bother. But then all of a sudden, this like sinking, like kind of feeling came over me, like kind of like I hurt somebody really bad. But it was strange. I didn't like talk to her or anything like that. And subsequently thereafter, I would come to the bar, and she was never there anymore. I would never see her. About like a year later, and I don't know, like there might be symbolism involved here, but I don't know why like certain things were in the dream that were in the dream. But I walked into the bar in the dream, and it seemed very lucid. Like I didn't even know I was dreaming. Like it felt like I was just going there again.
Right.
And there was nobody there. The place was like empty. And all of a sudden, there's like a little hallway where like the bar was, and then there was like a partition and a break like in the middle of it, and then there was like a dining room kind of area with booths and tables and whatnot. She came out like from that break and came towards me and said, "Who are you expecting? Were you looking for somebody?" And she kept like pushing me, and then like pushed me out the front door of the bar, and then I wound up getting into a car with her, which was like a 64 Chevy. I don't even know if that's significant or whatnot. And she's driving with me, and then all of a sudden, like we come to a railroad crossing, and she turns directly onto the tracks, and a train is like coming for the car. And she looks at me and she goes, "What were you afraid of? A train wreck?" And then I woke up. I woke up because like I'm believing I'm about to get killed by a train,
yeah.
And then I woke up like in my bed with my heart beating, and then I'm like, oh my God, thank God that was a dream. And then as an afterthought, I said to myself, I wonder whatever did happen to that girl. I mean, I never saw her again after that one night. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't like a voice said it to me. It was almost like it was just mainlined information into my head. Said, go to the Fulton Street pub this Friday, and you'll see her. And I'm like, Fulton Street pub? I haven't gone there in like 20 years, and that seemed like a bad bar or whatever, not a place like I'd want to go. And so I kept like thinking through the rest of the day, it's strange that some notion like that would occur to me. And then I challenged myself. I said, listen, just next Friday go there, if it's dead or if it's not like a nice place to be, just get in a cab and go to your regular spot.
Right.
So then this is really weird. So then I went to work. I think it was the next day, and I went out on my dinner break, and I came to a railroad crossing, and there was a car on the train tracks, positioned just like that. Not the same kind of car, but it was just odd. And then there was all people like pulling over and walking up to it and shaking it and whatnot and looking inside. And then the train came, and then I like got my car like away from the tracks, and the train hit the thing, and then I was like, whoa, and it didn't like catch on fire there. I remember it just like sparked and whatnot, but I just thought that was like really strange because it wasn't like it was hit. And then I was like thinking about like the dream I had and everything. And I was like, oh, that's bizarre. And then I went back to work, and the next day it was in the paper that the car had gotten hit, but nobody was in the car. Somebody, went off the road and got it stuck there or whatnot. And then it caused all this, mayhem on the railroad, and they had to repair it, and it caused all kinds of delays and everything. So then I'm guessing I had that dream like on a Tuesday. I'm thinking it was, and it told me to go there on a Friday. So that was like on Wednesday. So then, like on Thursday, I'm driving home from work, and it's like absolutely pouring, like torrential rain. And it's saying on the radio that we're going to have this for like the next 3 days, which would mean that it was going to be raining on Friday night too. So I said to myself, you know what? Maybe I'm not going to go there. I don't want to, go out in this rain and whatnot. And then on the radio, in the car, all of a sudden there's an advertisement for the Fulton Street Pub, which like I'd never heard like on the radio before. Like, and then saying all this band was going to be there playing all the songs from the 70s, R&B and rock and everything. I said, well, it sounds like a pretty cool band or whatever. Maybe I'll go. That's too much of a clue. I should definitely go. So then I work in the evening, so I'm off on this Friday because I have to work that weekend, and it's a good night to go out. I would either go out on Saturday or Friday, depending on whether I was off on Friday or Saturday. So I was definitely off on this Friday. So it's really a torrential rain, like at the time that I'm going to go out, and I'm like thinking, maybe I shouldn't do this. And then just like that morning, I woke up all of a sudden, just information. It wasn't like a voice whispering in my ear. It was like just mainlined information. Said, well, then you'll never know, will you? You know what I mean? So I was like, all right, that's just too weird. I'm doing it. So I call a cab, and I go there by a cab because I didn't want to, drink and drive or anything. And it pulls up to the bar, and it looks kind of like not nice. It's like a kind of rugged-looking guy out front smoking, because in New York you're not allowed to smoke in the bars, with like a bandana wrapped around his head and whatnot. And I said to myself, all right, you know what? I'll just go in, I'll get a drink, and it's not cool. I had the cab driver give me his number so I could call his cab to come back and get me. And, just go in. So I go in, and the band's playing. It's really cool in there. It doesn't, the outside was deceiving. And the first thing I do is I scan the whole bar, and I look around, and I don't see her in there at all. I don't see her anywhere. And then I see, it's a mixed crowd of, white collar and blue collar people, and it looks really cool. So I said, I'm just going to go to the bathroom, and then we go to the bar, and then I'm going to order a drink, and I'll hang for a while. So I go to the bathroom, come out, I go up to the bar, and the guy's pouring me up like a pint of Guinness. So I'm getting out my money, and I'm standing at the bar. By the way, I scanned the whole bar twice. I scanned it again when I came out of the bathroom. So now I'm getting out my money to pay for the drink, and all of a sudden I noticed a cell phone laying on the bar. It's funny, I didn't see that there before. And then all of a sudden this beautiful woman's hand comes over and grabs it. And I'm like, I'm going to follow that arm up, see where it goes. And all of a sudden it's her standing there. You know what I mean?
Oh.
Yeah. And she's not looking at me. She's looking like at the phone with a half-cocked smirk on her face. And I'm like, holy moly, I'm like, this is for real, and so I said, I have to talk to her tonight. I have to just say, I think I recognize you or something from somewhere else. Just see what's going on here or whatnot. And it seemed like I had a conversation with her, but it also seemed like while I was having a conversation with her, it was basically I was getting these mainline things coming to me you really blew it. Your thoughts about me were very impure, so it could never be now, or whatever. It was just the weirdest weirdest thing. I mean, I never experienced anything like that before in my life. I don't know what it was, how it happened. I can't explain it. Like I said, I've always wanted to see ghosts and other things, but that's never happened for me. This is what I can tell you happened to me, and it's very bizarre.
It is extremely bizarre and one of the best campfire stories we've ever heard. So, Tommy, I thank you so much for sharing with us. And, wow, you didn't see a ghost, but in some ways, I think what you saw was maybe even more remarkable.
I mean, I don't know. It changed my whole view on life. It's just like, it seems like, something I would see on TV. Like, this is not like something that really happens. And it's just, I still, when I think about it, I know it happened, and I just don't know how or why or what the heck, is going on behind the scenes. I guess we all find out when we die what's really there, but I mean, presently, I don't know. Okay, the addendum to the story is I subsequently had met a girl on a train, and I was traveling down to New York City on a train with her. I was coming from upstate New York to Grand Central Station. And I told her the story that I just told you, and she said, "Oh, that's a fabulous story. That's awesome. I'd like to use it for one of my creative writing classes at college." I was like, be my guest, because it's a good story. And that night I went out to the bar, and not the Fulton Street one, but the other bar, and she was in there, and I not the girl on the train, but the girl in the story. And I spoke to her briefly, but it was just like really weird. I was like, "Oh, that's strange." I just told the girl the story today, and then all of a sudden, there she is, and I hadn't seen her at that point in time, probably in 3 or 4 years, and she actually looked a little different. So it was just another bizarre coincidence, if it was or whatever, but it was strange.
But it's a story given by a guy in Long Island to a call-in show, another internet podcast, where he's telling of this experience with a girl that it's almost too bizarre to categorize. But the guy found himself attracted to a girl he saw at a bar, and she was communicating with him telepathically in his mind at the same time as outwardly she betrayed no indication. And all of these weird things happened. And for example, she became very offended at one point when he was too scared to go talk to her, and supposedly she sent into his mind, "What do you think I would be, a train wreck?" And the very next day when he's driving to work, he gets stuck behind a car in some traffic, and up ahead there had been a car on the train tracks that had been plowed through by a train. In other words, a train wreck. And other such instances occurred. And you have to ask the question, did this girl, for example, cause the train wreck simply to illustrate the point that she was upset that he thought that going out with her would be a train wreck? Well, that's absurd in a way. On the other hand, maybe it could be said that she was tapping into something which is that level of mind that human beings don't really often tap into. The way that the events themselves betray the quality of mind. And, you see this again and again with all of these beings that are reported, where they, are able to give you lottery numbers, for example. Well, what does that mean? Did they go in and physically change the ticket, or did they sort through the deck so that when you went to the store, that precise ticket would be the one you would? All this seems absurd when you talk about it in terms of gross physical manipulation. But when you're talking about experience itself as being a container for mind, and therefore physical events sort of just being within that container, and therefore anyone who is sufficiently mindful interacts with the universe in a way that we can't even imagine, in a certain sense. I wonder then if consciousness, the nature of consciousness for human beings, from our perspective, is not even fully illustrated to us during the psychedelic experience, and that you really need very specific kinds of, I don't want to say a shock, but almost like throwing gasoline on a flame. If you have a little pile of debris and it's burning, in a small flame, it's one thing. You toss, a lot of gasoline on it, the flame becomes something very different. And I suspect that all things being equal, even on a psychedelic trip, what you're talking about is just a different arrangement of the debris, the flame is still burning mostly the same way in most cases, and that to really tap into the nature of experience, the mind, the consciousness, and so on, I mean, it's a very rare thing, number one, but number two, it takes very specific set of stimuli for that to happen.
I mean, it's a truism that, a very small portion of what the brain actually does is available to conscious experience. Most of it happens in the background and it's not accessible to consciousness. I think the same is probably true of the mind. If the mind is, essentially non-local and atemporal phenomena that just happens to be focused in time, and it just happens to be sort of expressed through the brain in the way that a radio is expressing a radio transmission but not generating it, then there are all these relationships between events in sort of parallel, probable, unfolding realities that the mind can pick up on, and then structure as part of your subjective experience as an indicator of something that will happen, so that there'll be a coordination between, let's say, what the girl said in the bar and what happened the next day. I mean, the whole thing could be, this person's own psychic faculties completely imagining that the girl is in his head, and completely, but the fact remains that he has some intimation of the fact that there'll be the train crash, and that gets filtered into the experience. I mean, we have a perfect example of what is called underdetermination in the philosophy of science. Underdetermination is a situation where you have multiple theories or ontologies that are compatible with the same data set, because all those theories fit both the data set and its predictions. And you see that, of course, with quantum mechanics, because we have the many worlds interpretation, we have the Copenhagen interpretation, we have any number of different stories about what's going on in quantum reality, and they're all compatible with the math as it stands. And the same thing is true with whatever ontology we want to posit to account for psychic phenomena, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, sort of precognition, telepathy. There are all kinds of different narratives we could imagine that would be consistent with that. And I think it's a murky path forward, but there is a path forward because I think, even with these otherworldly things, it still remains that nature prefers simplicity and elegance, and so all things being equal, the simplest answer is usually the right one. So if we bear that in mind, and if we bear issues of internal coherence in mind, and if we try to fit our speculations as closely to the data as possible without overstepping into speculation, it is possible to move forward in understanding what this is, but not easy. But yes, definitely the mind and the quality of mindedness is everywhere permeating, and it comes up in all these things.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at, I mean, you'll have to listen to the story because it's entertaining for a lot of reasons, but it's also, to me, I think it's a perfect entree to this whole domain. If you take the problem of synchronicity in general, if some otherworldly being says something to you one night and the next day you see it on a license plate, or some recurring pattern of numbers keeps appearing again and again and again. My feeling at this moment is that today people will still attempt to understand this causally, but they'll revert to a magical explanation For example, maybe the girl he was talking to in the bar knew, quote unquote, that there would be a train wreck that he would see, and so she used that metaphor. Or the thing about the license plate. Well, maybe the alien knew that you would see that license plate and therefore said such and such, like a prediction. In other words, basically a physical operation. Or in other words, the independence of the physical world is still safe, but somebody just happens to have inside knowledge about it. And apart from prediction, there are other ways you can do more or less the same type thing. To me, though, I see this more and more in terms of there being no essential difference between the physical event and the knower, that you cannot fully say at that level of mind that there is a difference between the knower and the world where the event occurs. In other words, one demands the other and the other demands the one. So rather than saying that, let's say the girl in the bar either knew that there would be a train wreck or caused it or anything like that, the standard categories of agency and cause and effect and so on, that somehow the train wreck and her saying something about the train wreck were of a piece, that was the total event. And that when you reach this level of mind that some of these entities seem to possess or exhibit, the whole thing is the event. And you can talk about that if you like in terms of collapsing temporalities or whatever you want to. But I mean, the main thing to me, the logical distinction is to say that it's not something that we can break into parts and try to look at and say, well, what part is responsible? The whole thing is actually the event. And this is the character of the synchronicity, because you have the universe itself, the world, behaving in a symbolically meaningful way, in a non-random way. And I don't think at this point, given the way these things work, they seem to work at least, I don't think at this point it's something that's caused. I don't think it's like a message. I don't think it's something that is created and therefore is, not a natural event or, therefore an unnatural event. No, I think it's actually a natural event in the way that we take events in the outside world to be natural and unmotivated. And yet at the same time, it's pure motivation. And that when you have these apparently telepathic beings involved, that they are simply operating on that level. The story that you told about the being at the foot of the bed, you're in the dream state, you're fully in the dream state, having a dream, you're dreaming it. You wake up and it's the same thing, as if there's no difference between dream and reality. Now, normally when somebody says that, they say it as if to suggest one has the character of the other. If you say there's no difference between dream and reality, really you're saying reality is a dream in most cases. So I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is if there's some underlying level in which there's no difference and that level has a character, that character may be the character we encounter when we hear stories about these synchronicities, which are not just symbolic in terms of seeing a set of numbers, but I mean, if there's a train wreck, for Christ's sake, that's a pretty grossly physical event. And yet that's involved in this synchronicity.
For sure. I think that you pick a very good word when you say that there's a simultaneity between the train wreck and the girl's cognition of it and its transmission into the guy's mind. Because if we're talking about non-local, atemporal phenomena, then causality, as usually invoked, is not a sufficiently robust concept. It's still causal in the sense that there's a set of causes and conditions that allow for the train wreck to occur and a set of causes and conditions that allow for the girl to cognize it, and a set of causes and conditions that allow for the girl's mind to come into contact with the guy's mind, right? But it's more like a set of timeless geometrical relationships. When you have things interacting in a Euclidean plane, it's not as if one thing happens before the other. There's an interaction between these intersecting lines but it's not causal in the sense that it's not temporal. Causality implies that there's a sequence, but this is non-sequential, essentially non-sequential set of relationships that then gets translated down into a sort of lower dimensional matrix. You know what I'm saying?
I'm with you on this because it's not as if when you listen to the call-in story that you get the sense that this girl, for example, caused a train wreck, in some sort of like poltergeist style fashion in order to express her measure of displeasure. It's not like that at all. The only sense you can really get out of it, and this is just one story of many, the only sense you can really get out of it is that the event was created simply by knowing about it. It wasn't predicted. That's not the same thing. The event was created not by her intentionally willing destruction, maybe the loss of life because she's upset that some guy is, scared of talking to her, but rather simply by knowing it, she created the event. Obviously, she was somehow involved because it's just the sense that you get. So you're talking about, I'm not saying. I mean, I agree with you that it's not enough to write off synchronicity to the obscurantism of mysticism, which is what most people do. So causality is still lurking in the wings to the extent that we want to say things that are logical and meaningful about what's going on. But naturally, if you're talking about something that's extratemporal, at least when it comes to our conventional mode of temporality, then the standard type of causality just doesn't apply. So the only thing you can say is that it's of a piece. The knowing of the event and the event itself the next day are of a piece. And all of these synchronicities are somehow of a piece. And I think that in the presence of any sufficiently powerful consciousness, there are synchronicities left in their wake. You hear this all the time when there's a contact experience. The visitors are there some night, and then for the next, 8 days straight, you've got nonstop synchronicities. Well, do we really think that each of those is some sort of quasi-mystical signal from the visitors trying to tell you something? No, I think if you have a powerful enough mind at that level, the universe is organized. I mean, the mind is an organizing force, and therefore the residual organization continues on even after they've left. I mean, maybe they're not even paying attention at that point, but there where they were, you've got all these little ripples of self-organization that occur in their wake.
Sure. It seems to admit, I think a good word to introduce into this might be entrainment. I mean, you've heard of brainwave entrainment where, people listen to, waves that, waveforms that will induce a alpha, beta, delta, or gamma state, right? And you sort of, your mind falls into sync with what you're listening to, right?
Sure.
Now, I don't know about the legitimacy of that, but as a metaphor, I think that your consciousness can get entrained to another consciousness. In Hinduism, they have a practice called darshan, right? And in darshan, you basically just sit and behold the guru, and you just sort of partake in their level of consciousness. And you just look at them and you derive from their presence something of their level of mind, right? So it's kind of like that, but sort of just arising by happenstance. You come into contact with these beings, and because we're effectively telepathic too, but don't acknowledge it or haven't tapped into it or utilized it, or it's culturally suppressed or whatever, we don't know it. But when we're in their presence, something is activated, and then so our ability to recognize this coordinated and meaningful sort of underlying structure is temporarily enhanced. I know for sure that, a lot of times after I've run into one of these beings, that the instance of precognitive dreams that I have is just sort of, amped up significantly, as if like something has happened where my mind is now like operating in a way that it's able to sort of get clued into things that haven't happened yet. And it's very peculiar, and it doesn't seem to be a meaningful communication unless the point of the communication is that the mind is outside of time. Because, I mean, the things that are foreseen are mostly entirely banal. Their only real value is in showing that it's possible in principle.
Well, I don't doubt that that's the case at all. In fact, you hear it again and again in terms of the people who have come into contact with them. The more powerful intelligence is sort of rubbing off on them, What I was trying to get at is something that may or may not occur alongside that, which is the direct effect on quote unquote physical reality by the visitors themselves continuing to occur even after they've departed. You could use the same term entrainment and talk about the entrainment of physical events in a certain sense. The fact that in the presence of a sufficiently powerful consciousness, the physical surroundings begin to organize in more meaningful ways. And my sense is that perhaps that continues even after they have left, although the same events could be explained by what you've described, where somebody who, that it's rubbed off on them and the untapped potential is in there. They're still sort of geared up in that quasi-telepathic mode. Maybe that person himself is the quote unquote cause of the synchronicity that occurs days after they've gone. It's hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about, the influence on the quote-unquote physical world being amped up in the wake of their presence, I mean, that's potentially a part of it too. I mean, or both things could be happening. We don't have a way of isolating the variables, so we can't really say. But I mean, that's magic. I mean, in the sort of literal, hermetic, alchemical, Kabbalistic sense of the word magic, because the mind is creating reality all the time, so to speak, right? Because that's sort of a loose statement that is problematic for any number of reasons. But let's say the mind is exerting substantial influence on the reality that we experience, right? It's shaping and directing our reality tunnel, you might say. But Crowley said that, it's not a question of whether you should learn magic. He said that, the fact of the matter is we're doing magic all the time. The question is whether you're doing it well or whether you're doing it badly. And so you'd be better off to learn its essential principles, because why do it blindly? You know what I'm saying? So maybe the mind is always sort of shaping things, and usually we're doing it in this sort of haphazard, sort of non-intentional way. If you become a sort of attractor for these synchronicities, then the thing is then different.
Yeah, it seems that way. It seems as if the human being, under ordinary circumstances, is given just enough mind to suffice, and that even though there may be an ultimate separation between mind and brain, the two cohabit, and under ordinary circumstances, you go through your life and everything's operating at a kind of baseline. And it really takes extraordinary circumstances either to A, liberate the mind from the brain in some sort of separation of perception, from your physical body, or B, for the mind to be so amped up that it experiences the world around it as a further manifestation of mind, which it may, in some sense, ultimately be. The grossly physical world is something that may be totally manipulated by the mind if you have a sufficiently powerful mind. But because we lack all strength or ability in that regard, we just simply, we never notice. And so, because when I, hear these stories about, one comes to mind about a lawyer who, like so many lawyers, it was venal and, wanted some sort of assistance from the visitors in getting rich with lottery tickets and so on. There was a connection between the numbers that were given and the numbers appearing on the ticket and so on. And so you would say, okay, well, did they predict that the numbers were there? Did they alter the ticket? Neither really seems likely in a sense, because these are kind of like, they don't seem likely to me anymore. They're base physical manipulations of things. So what's really going on? It would be a more direct mental manipulation of reality.
Sure.
And especially when you consider that mind itself has a relation to non-randomness that may be fundamental. You know, this sort of thing becomes easier to understand. But
Well, one of the potential ways of hashing that out that a lot of practicing magicians embrace is that, how should I say, that you have this question of whether or not you do magical working, right? And it then has some influence on what's going to happen. You say you do a working to get $50, and then you happen to walk down the street in such a way that you happen upon a $50 bill that's on the ground, right? Now, did you cause it to be there, or did you give yourself some kind of unconscious precognition of where you would find it? I think that's kind of close. I think that if most of mind is happening outside the purview of temporal localized consciousness, the temporal localized consciousness can be sort of shaped and directed from this atemporal level, right? So almost as if it's a sort of avatar that's sort of barely conscious of the operations of this larger mechanism, right? So take those experiments that purportedly undermine personal choice, right? Where a person is asked to perform an action, and then somehow indicate the moment at which the volition took place to perform the action. And they've got this EEG or this PET scan or some kind of brain scanning device running. And what the experiment purports to show is that the actual event in the brain that led to the motor execution of the task was before the volition. So volition is an illusion, right? And I think that that's metaphysically naive. Maybe the subjective experience of the volition comes after the volition, but that doesn't mean there wasn't a volition. So what if we take that and we map it onto the energetic and non-physical? What if what we think are our volitions are really something that's happening in the wake of another sort of intentional process that's happening on the non-physical level? And so we are influenced by some intelligence, or we're influencing ourselves to take the street that leads to the $50. And that other intelligence could be incomprehensibly more capable of measuring the variables.
Well, I'm with you completely, and it would also account for the hit or miss quality to meditation and to spiritual practice. The fact that not 100% of people who undertake these practices reap the benefits. The mindfulness training and so on and so forth is perhaps just a kind of tip of the iceberg where all of the decisive action takes place off stage elsewhere. And for some people, they're able to achieve meaningful results, and others doing the exact same thing and perhaps just as sincerely don't have the results. Well, why would that be? It's not enough to say, well, it's a subjective experience, not an objective one. Therefore, anything's possible. I think that's probably a cop-out. It may well be that on all of these other levels where mind is actually taking place, things are happening that decisively influence or cause the outcome.
Well, I think that's true, but I think there's something that's worth talking about when we're trying to talk about that, which is this: that with meditative practice or any kind of similar contemplative discipline, I think most of what people are doing is very poorly informed. And everybody's heard the expression, it's not practice that makes perfect, it's perfect practice that makes perfect, right? And I think that with meditation, I really do think that anyone who has very good instruction and a very clear idea of what they're trying to do and how it works can usually get what they're trying to get if they put in the effort. But if, people just sort of anecdotally and loosely say, well, I tried mindfulness practice and I didn't get anything out of it. Well, what does that mean? I mean, mindfulness practice is a really sort of loose term that gets bandied about and abused. But I think I'll give you an example. There are monasteries in Southeast Asia where it's pretty much expected that if you sit there for a good enough period of time, you'll have the direct perception of emptiness. Emptiness here being the term for the underlying nature, the ultimate nature of reality, right? And I heard about an abbot there who said, if you've been here for a while and you haven't had stream entry, that you haven't had your first direct perception of emptiness, I don't know what you're doing because there's nothing else here to do. Which is sort of funny because if you sort of there really is nothing else to do, but that doesn't preclude the fact that whether or not you get those instructions could be a function of this offstage calculation.
Well, that's sort of what I'm getting at. Naturally, there's going to be, there are going to be people who, in the ordinary parlance, they don't know what they're doing. But the fact is that if you don't have a practice leading to 100% enlightenment, if that's your metric in every case, or most identical outcomes, then it could be a manifestation of the same type of thing. If the mind is slippery in its relation to physical reality and to itself already, and just at the basic level of trying to score a lottery ticket, then when you're engaged in lifelong practice, it seems to me the stakes are even higher, and therefore the potential uncertainty is higher as to what's actually happening when all of these things are going on.
Sure. I think all this sort of is where we start bumping up against traditional concepts like karma, because there's a very naive way you could understand that, but I think that karma itself is just a word that means cause and effect, right? So what we're talking about, this sort of offstage calculation of how events are going to be organized, it really falls under that umbrella, because karma is supposed to be the unfolding of the sum total of the mental and emotional momentum you've created through your choices and decisions, right? So there are two possibilities. On the one hand, you've either got a conscious, self-organizing sort of oversoul, which is shaping your reality. On the other hand, if the process is the sum of the influences of what have gone into some kind of residuum or underlying stream of experiences, then it falls into that karma model where what's happening on the temporal part of the system sort of logs some potentials in the atemporal part, which are then brought about later, not necessarily even through conscious design as if it were the oversoul model, but through a sort of feedback loop. And the way I like to think, I talk about this when I hash out the concept of karma, is it's not like dreaming, because if you are awake all day and you're focusing on violence and murder, let's say you're playing Grand Theft Auto, and then you watch Silence of the Lambs, and then you actually go in the basement and you kill somebody, and then you have a nightmare about being murdered. So that's like karma, so you have a lifetime where you're a murderer, and then you have another life where you're being murdered, because you're going from one dream to the next, so to speak, and what you fill your mind stream with is what's going to arise. And so the problem of samsara, the problem of being trapped in Maya illusion, is that we all have this creative capacity, but we're doing it blindly because we don't know that we have it, and we're filling our mind with the potentials for further suffering and further unenlightenment. And the trick is to know that you're doing it.
Well, I agree with you. There has to be some sort of relationship, even if calling it causal, hearkening back to what we were discussing before, even if calling it that is ultimately just a metaphor. So there has to be, you can't have a dualism where you've got these two spheres and they don't interact, because it's absurd. So I would see the relationship between conscious effort and the result that you obtain as being a very highly complex one. Maybe that can be guided uniformly over time in many cases, but I think we know this intuitively whenever we try to work on ourselves, that you're dealing with something which has a complexity that exceeds your grasp, even though it's, supposedly you working on yourself. Indulge in the illusion of self-presence to that extent. And when you consider what you're talking about under the label of karma, I mean, it's even more vast and complex what you're dealing with.
Absolutely. I think vast and complex is a good summation of this whole field.